Welcome to Cultic Cube, where we cube religiously. We make you better at cube and make your cube better. Today we will discuss how to design one's multicolor section. Gold cards configure a flavorful marriage of disparate elements of the color pie. But there is a real design cost to including gold cards in great numbers. This video aims to give you the tools to decide which gold cards to include and why. The genesis for this topic was a conversation I had with a viewer who is curious about cubing archetype signposts in one's gold section. I will absolutely address this question, but I want to think about some of the more basic concerns with gold card inclusion first. Hence we will discuss first advantages and disadvantages to gold cards, and what density of them one should run in one's cube. We will touch on the problems of categorizing gold cards. Ultimately, we will arrive at a discussion of using gold cards to signal archetypes versus including those that are powerful in a vacuum. Gold cards are beloved by many, and they operate in a unique design space, wherein Wizards tries to express mechanical overlap between different colors. These multicolored cards tend to benefit strategies other than aggro, as aggro is interested in cleaving as close as possible to one color, and it is all about one-drops, which traditional gold cards definitionally are not. And 2 CMC gold cards, with 2 different mana pips, are difficult to cast on curve. Control in particular often benefits from access to efficient removal offered in gold. Gold cards, though, are generally undesirable in a draft setting. Imagine that one is in the middle of a draft and solidly committed to 2 colors. Assuming an even distribution of colors in the cube, a single color card has a 40% chance of being on color, whereas a non-hybrid 2-color gold card has only a 10% chance of the same. Moreover, experienced drafters tend to avoid picking gold cards highly, as these are at greater risk of not making one's deck than single-color or colorless cards. I conducted an informal and entirely unscientific survey on Twitter of those gold cards that you all consider first pickable. The aggregated list is quite small, and only 3 cards emerged as clear forerunners: Dak Faden in powered environments, Fractured Identity, and Ashiok. Given my own drafting predilections, I am extremely unlikely to start on a gold card. Mark Rosewater writes often about a metric that he calls ASFAN, which indicates the probability of a theme being visible when one fans out a booster pack. Looking at the gold card ASFAN of retail sets from the past year or so, we discover a huge disparity. M20's gold ASFAN of 0.38 means that one will open an average of just over 1 gold card in 3 packs. Guilds of Ravnica's 3.36 means that one expects to see between 3 and 4 gold cards per pack. Of course, the Ravnican universe is famously organized around multicolored cards, so Wizards pushes the number of such cards here. Still, this high ASFAN is deceptive, in that GRN represents only 5 of the 10 color pairs, and Ravnica Allegiance features the rest. In the retail draft setting, one is highly incentivized to be in one of these 5 pairs, with the result that it is a near certainty that at least one person at the table is in each of the guilds. Thus, none of the gold cards should keep circling the table solely because of color mismatch. This is a very different situation from the cube that supports all 10 color pairs. 2 color cards may never find a home if no one at the table is interested in the color pair. And this problem becomes much more acute when considering cards of 3 or more colors. All this is to say that in a typical cube, I discourage Ravnica levels of gold ASFAN. I suggest, as a very rough guide, that one aim for a gold ASFAN of between 0.5 and 1.7, which means between 5 and 11% of one's cube is comprised of multicolored cards. I would also tend to avoid most cards of 3 or more colors, excepting those that one does not expect to cast, such as Sphinx of the Steel Wind or Progenitus. I certainly would not fault you for running a Nicol Bolas or some other pet cards. I would not, however, spend 10 slots on a card from each shard and wedge. Another item to consider is how one treats cards with hybrid mana symbols. I have colleagues who place these in an entirely different category from the traditional gold cards. I understand this impulse, as the point of hybrids is that they may be cast as single-color cards. I consider the color identity of my hybrids on a case-by-case basis. Dryad Militant I count as a white 1-drop, as I support white weenie but not green aggro. Figure of Destiny, by contrast, I classify as Boros, as it is a legitimate pick for white or red aggro. Cards with off-color activation costs, flashback costs, or the like may also present one with classification challenges. As above, though, for me the main consideration is whether one wants to be able to get value out of all the colors in order to run the card. Thus Lingering Souls I call Orzhov, while Najeela the Blade Blossom is mono red, and Life Death I call black. Another gold section hack is that one need not equally support every guild. Some guilds simply have better options than others. For instance, Azorius is fairly bursting at the seams with good cards, especially those that support controlling strategies. By contrast, options tend to be worse in the guilds that combine two aggressive colors, such as Boros and Rakdos. Part of the problem is that most gold cards are not desirable in aggressive decks, which prefer to run light on lands and to skew heavily towards one color. Simic and Selesnya are guilds that traditionally have had poor options outside of mid-range support. I suggest that you consider running more cards in certain guilds than in others. Your drafters are unlikely to notice if you have 3 more Azorius cards than Simic, for instance. In fact, I suggest that you are probably doing a version of this anyway, inasmuch as certain monocolored cards are secretly guild cards. Wrath of God is a virtual Azorius card, as one is almost certainly running it in blue-white control. Let us finally turn to the content of one's gold section, rather than consider numbers. There are 3 main approaches to filling out the multicolor list: staking out archetypes with signpost cards, running interesting and beloved cards, or simply playing the highest power level cards. These strategies may, of course, be mixed and matched. The signpost card is an inheritance of Wizards' design principles for retail draft. Often gold uncommons strongly suggest the mechanical themes that WotC is pushing for a given color pair. This is a principle that cube designers may borrow, such that one populates one's gold section with archetype enablers. I think this idea may be useful in small doses if one is heavily invested in promoting particular archetypes. I have some reservations about the strategy, though. First, it is not self-evident that cubes with established playgroups require signposts, though if you regularly serve different cube clientele, then signposts may go up in value. Second, too heavy an archetype push can lead to on-rails drafting experiences. Consider tribal-heavy retail sets that reward one for simply picking every goblin card, for instance. Many people find that this does not make for the most interesting draft experience, and it may lead to repetitive gameplay. Third, we have already discussed how some number of gold cards are unlikely to be desired at a given table. This problem worsens when the gold cards are still narrower in application, as people will be less interested in splashing narrow cards that are off-theme. Cube Cats has a new podcast whose first episode treats archetypal parasitism in Cube, and the hosts do a fine job explaining these points in fuller detail. One can also fill out one's gold section with cards that are sweet, interesting, unusual, or beloved. This is a perfectly reasonable strategy, provided that one takes care that such cards operate within a similar power band as the rest of one's environment. Such design selection is often a feature of EDH-inspired cubes. Just remember that pet cards should not be trap cards. Finally, one can maximize for power level. I can well understand why some people dislike this strategy, as it often leads to conditions such as Golgari being occupied almost entirely by removal spells. I am not averse to cubing multiples of particular effects, especially when these play to color pie strengths. I'll cube all the preordains and searing spheres that WotC cares to print. Nevertheless, one can well fill out guild sections with cards that are powerful effects that are not functionally identical. I am not advocating that one betray one's cube's goals in order to maximize power level, but I do caution that one should be extremely careful not to introduce snares that lead drafters into archetypes that fundamentally underperform in the environment. Whether one cubes signposts, sweet cards, or power max cards, one's priority should be crafting a fun and reasonably balanced environment. At top left, you will find a link to my overview of approaches to including signets in your cube. Let's keep hanging out and chatting cube.